this book was about, it was written in, I was just looking this up, 1900, so the year 1900, and the economic monetary, um, I guess, backdrop at the day of the day in the U.S. was there was a debate over the gold standard versus the silver standard to back the U.S. dollar. I'm actually not super familiar, and I'd like to get more educated on that era of U.S. monetary history. But I understand like the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was some questioning over which standard we should adopt, and there were gold proponents and silver proponents. Fill in some of the historical details for me if you know them, Mel.
Yeah, well, I think really what was happening was the discovery of large silver deposits in the western United States, and silver, which historically was part of the U.S. monetary system. So when we started out, Hamilton put in place a bimetallic standard. So gold and silver were both the monetary metals, initially at a ratio of 15 to 1. It was later changed to 16 to 1. But silver was always legal currency. For most of the beginning of American history, we actually used the Spanish dollar. That's why we call our currency the dollar. There was a Spanish silver coin called the dollar that wound up being like 80% of currency in early America. You could always take silver to the mint. The U.S. Mint would freely melt down and mint your silver into U.S. coins. But most Americans, silver is silver, gold is gold. They didn't care if it was Spanish or whatever. There are details with that. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but it's kind of fascinating Gresham's law type stuff and how we wound up almost entirely in circulation in the early Americas with fractional Spanish silver coins because of slight differences in the gold content and silver content of U.S. minted coins and Spanish coins. But to get to your point is in 1873 there was a law passed, the Coinage Act of 73, which became known as the Crime of 73, and it essentially took silver out of the monetary system. And again, the addition of silver was kind of a threat, especially to the European banking establishment, which was based upon gold. And we had these silver deposits in the western United States, and essentially they were pulling in a monetary supply that the Europeans, were not keen on. And the U.S. eventually kind of came over to the European side of things, as they often did, due to international financial influence, and took away this. And this was a major issue in the United States. And there was these people called Silverites. It was the Free Silver Movement.
Yes, that's right.
In 1896, William Jennings Bryan did a speech on
the Cross of Gold speech.
Yeah, do not crucify us on this cross of gold, which was basically saying, look, the people's money is silver and you're trying to take that away from us. And, you want it to all be gold, which is essentially a European metal. And so there's been monetary issues, monetary crises, going back to the revolution, when we went from printing, 2 million fiat dollars in 1775 to fund the revolution. These were called continentals. By the end of the war, we printed over 160 million fiat continentals. And eventually they were redeemed by the Treasury at 1 continental to 1 penny. So it was devalued by 100 times by the end of the war, the original currency of the Continental Congress. So, these types of things, monetary collapses, fiat money printing, influence of European banking establishment, really go back to the founding of our country. And we've constantly been in these battles, these monetary battles, and sometimes they're at the forefront of things like they were in the late 1800s. They came back kind of a little bit into the picture in the 70s when Nixon took us off the convertibility of gold. But now they're coming back again. And so I think we're in another one of these moments where the average American is starting to wake up to the importance of the monetary system again.
That's right. Okay. Now you're giving me some flashbacks to my U.S. history classes and the Cross of Gold speech and Williams Jennings Bryan and all of those details. What's interesting, I think we'll pull this up often as we go through this podcast talking about banks and where they are today and where they're going in the future, is these monetary decisions have always been political, haven't they? And they've always been about control of, they're winners and losers in these types of monetary decisions. And they also always exist in kind of this geopolitical game theory. Of course, the reason we don't talk about silver today is because in the 1900s, gold basically won, didn't it? I seem to recall it was like maybe China was a holdout for a while on some sort of silver-based standard, but they were like Europe had kind of the gold standard. The U.S. it sounds like was sort of playing with maybe a silver standard, being like the people's money, and to like push back against the Europeans and the elites in the U.S. society. But they eventually lost. The European gold standard kind of won out in China. I believe they also had to relent at some point in time. So there's also this geopolitical game theoretic, monetary dominance type of aspect to all of these decisions as well. And so a society like the United States can't just make monetary decisions in a vacuum. Anyway, those are some themes I think we'll continue to tug on. But do you have any reflections on that, Mel?
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, China dominated the world really in the 1500s. I think most people would consider the emperor of China at that time the most powerful man on the planet. And I think it was in 1591, he demanded that all taxes be paid in silver. So China has a long connection with silver, and China doesn't have large silver deposits. And at one point, gold and silver traded 1-for-1 in China. And what really happened was the Europeans, once they discovered the New World, they set up this global trade loop of, mining silver in the Americas, taking it to China, getting Chinese goods, spices, tapestries, silks, and then bringing it back. Eventually, they got tired of bringing silver to China, and they literally like got together and said, we need to start giving China something other than silver. What do they want? And the Chinese emperors are like, we don't need anything. And so the Westerners eventually got them hooked on, opium. And so this was the start of the Opium Wars, and it was really the British East India Company who came up with this idea of if we can get the Chinese population hooked on opium, we'll be able to, instead of having to give them silver, we'll be able to give them drugs, basically. And it was a huge thing. It started what eventually became known in Chinese history as the Century of Humiliation, where they were dominated by foreign powers in a way that they'd never been. And in some sense, I think the Chinese, that's still relevant to them, and they still, remember it. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's people who are like, hey, if people are using our chemicals in Mexico to make fentanyl, well, you know what? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. They did it to us for a long time, pumping drugs into our society. If drugs wind up going into the United States, manufactured in Mexico with, input products coming from China, so be it.
Do you know the story, by the way, to tie that thread off of why China had to sort of, how long they were on the silver standard and why they had to kind of capitulate to something else and move off of it? Did they capitulate to gold, or did they, skip that step and go directly to kind of a fiat system? I'm just not familiar with the history here.
Yeah, I'm not a massive expert on what I would consider 20th century Chinese monetary policy, which is when this would have had to happen. Obviously, there was a big, revolution there. And I can say this, which is kind of also interesting, just, their system has always been, kind of monetary focused. And the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, is an interesting central bank, in my opinion. It's a central bank that plays in the global central bank system. They're members of the Bank for International Settlements. They go and they meet every 2 months. Jerome Powell, Christine Lagarde, the head of the PBOC, and 60 other central banks. But at the same time, the PBOC is different in that it is not in any way independent. It's directly answerable to the party, and they do a lot more than just setting an interest, like a Fed funds rate, like the Federal Reserve does. They're able to set actual rates in the market. They're able to set the prime rate, mortgage rates. So it's done by, fiat, where, the central bank decides this is what the mortgage rate's going to be, whether or not that makes sense for market conditions. So there's a slightly different monetary system in China. It's obviously much more centralized, controlled, but definitely gold has been building on their balance sheets. And a lot of people do not realize that in 2007, China surpassed South Africa as the world's largest gold producer. They do not allow for the export of domestically mined gold. And many people believe that the Chinese hold a lot more gold than they publicly release. They state they hold around 2,000 some metric tons. If you look at America, we claim we have 8,000 metric tons or so. Some people believe that the Chinese holdings of gold could actually be over 30,000 metric tons, and that they're accumulating it essentially under the radar as they incorporate gold more into their reserve asset basket, and other central banks outside of the West began increasing the gold holdings on central bank balance sheets.
Luke Roman was recently on our podcast, and he was just talking about, and this is even with the public data, just kind of the record of China accumulating gold and how that has accelerated in recent years. But since he used the B word, banks, let's turn our focus to them. So we've got we've talked a little bit about money systems across the last few hundred years, and the U.S. itself was born on a bi-monetary metal system of gold and silver backed in kind of the early days for its fiat system. But then we skipped forward and we talked about the People's Bank of China, the PBOC, right? And that brings into the conversation this new entity on the block in the last 500 years or so, the bank. And the modern manifestation of that, when you max power of the banking establishment, you get a central bank like the People's Bank of China. And of course, the Fed is all powerful. There's various banks in the European Union that are very powerful as well. Can you give us the context and the history of banks? And maybe we could start with a Thomas Jefferson quote. I don't know if this is apocryphal or he said this in a documented letter at all, but I know it's one that you are a fan of, which is he said this, Thomas Jefferson: "Banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies." What do you think Jefferson meant? And then tell us, pointing out the danger of banks, and then give us some history of banks and how we came to be in the system that we presently are in.
So it's not apocryphal. It's from a letter he wrote. I think it was in 1812 or 1816 to John Taylor, and there was obviously big debates around central banking in the formation of our country. Jefferson was adamantly opposed to a central bank, as were most of what were then called the Republicans. This was a different party than what became what we now know as the Republicans, but essentially the first two parties were relatively known as the Republicans. These were Jeffersonians and the Federalists, people like John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, who were more globalist in nature. But I think that really what's happening and what he's talking about there was he understood, and I think it was actually broadly understood at the time, the influence that central banks have and how they essentially manipulate the system in order to siphon wealth from the people into government hands and allow for the government to do things such as fund foreign wars or other activities. And this goes back to the beginning of central banking, which was the original purpose of it. So I think there was a shift that took place kind of 1600s where you had essentially total dominance of political, social, economic power in the aristocracy, in the kings and the dukes, and they didn't need to hide things. If they didn't like what a village was doing, they could send in the army and burn down the town and take the grain. They could act unilaterally. And what began to happen is that the sovereigns began running into money problems. So they weren't obviously printing fiat at the time. Money was gold and silver at that moment. And so William III, he was the King of England that put in place the Bank of England, the forerunner of all modern central banks. In the late 1690s, he had wanted to continue a war with France. The treasury was dry. He had essentially overtaxed his people already. He knew that if he continued to raise taxes, there would be revolts. He also had borrowed heavily from wealthy Londoners and bankers and had defaulted. He wasn't able to pay them back, and so his credit was no good. He had no way to get money, and he talked to the banking class, and he said, "Look, I need gold and silver to manufacture ships and pay soldiers who will only accept coin. And the bankers basically said, well, look, we're not going to give you our money, but give us the exclusive right to print paper notes, make it illegal not to accept these notes for transactions, enforce that, and, charter us a bank. And this was the Bank of England was chartered. It was owned by private bankers. And what they did was they went out, they essentially forced the people to turn in their gold and silver to get these paper notes, pass the gold and silver to the king, and then collected interest. And so the bankers were able to, instead of putting up their own money, which is what they had been doing in the past, they found a better way. They could put up the people's money and collect interest on it. And that is what our central bank, still does to this day. People put their money into a bank, you're loaning money to the bank, and the bank is, especially if they're a big bank like a JP Morgan, they're giving you almost zero interest. They're taking that money and they're either putting it with the Federal Reserve, where they get paid interest on reserves of 5+% right now, or they're loaning it out for more risky enterprises that, should those risks go bad, they know that people will come bail that out. So it's essentially, a heads they win, tails they win situation. And that is what banks do. They take in people's money, they loan it out, and they collect interest. And it hasn't changed since 1694.
Interesting. So your lens on banks, in particular central banks, is almost that it's an unholy alliance between sovereigns and governments, and kind of like the private banking industry. It's sort of interesting that banks weren't really started by governments. At least there was a market need for private banks, right? These institutions that would grow up, these kind of money lenders who would provide you a loan if you needed a loan to do something, or a way to store your wealth in a vault where it's protected. And that was kind of the private market force that started the institution of banks. But you're saying very early on, there came to be this unholy alliance between sovereigns and governments and private bankers that went a little bit like this, where the sovereigns and the governments were like, hey, we need more tax money to fund our things. Maybe it's a war, maybe some sort of crisis moment. And they go over and they look at the banks and they say, well, you've got a lot of the money present of the population. Perhaps we can strike a deal. And the private bankers are like, yeah, that sounds good. We want to create an alliance with the state, become sort of a quasi-sovereign entity, give us special rights, special access, and in return, we will allow you to control elements of society. And that was sort of the unholy alliance that happened early, not at the moment private banks were born, but early in its childhood, I suppose. And you're saying that relationship, the private bankers get wealthy, central bankers get more ability to tax and control. You're saying that relationship still exists today, and you're going even further. You're saying that that's kind of the point. That's almost the genesis of this entire system.
Yeah, it's the raison d'etre. It's the reason for their existence. It's what their fundamental purpose is. Everything else is ancillary. And it goes back to the beginning. I mean, you can go back to 1066 to William the Conqueror when he unified England. There was one area of England that he was unable to subdue, and it's what is now known as the City of London, the Wall Street of London. And he was unable to essentially take that over. And I think part of it was he didn't want to take it over. And you've seen this throughout history. You saw it in Europe in the 1940s, where whether a country had declared itself as neutral or not, Hitler was going to go in and take it over. The one country he didn't go into was Switzerland. Switzerland, home of Bank for International Settlements. This was the conduit of Western money feeding the Third Reich. These things are documented. We can get into the details on how this actually occurred, but basically, there's always been this unholy alliance, and to this day, the City of London is the only. Within London, there's different neighborhoods of the City of London. But there's two what are called cities. There's the City of London, which is a 1 square mile area where all the banks are headquarters, where the Bank of England is headquartered. And then there's the city of Westminster, which is where the government is headquartered. And both of those cities within London have different rules and regulations than anywhere else in the country. There, in the city of London, believe it or not, it's not people that elect the mayor of the city of London. There's this guy called the Lord of London. He's Lord Mayor of London, and this is just for the 1 square mile financial district, and is actually elected by the corporations to this day. So the banks vote in the political power. It's not an individual that lives there, and they have different rights and legal things. There's still an annual parade. I think it's on November 11th, which is an important day for the city of London, where the Lord Mayor goes around in the old English stuff, and he's got these statues of Gog and Magog being paraded, and there's all kinds of weird, like, paganistic type rituals around it. And this stuff is in the law, and you're like, are you serious? And I'm like, yes, I am serious that these central bankers are almost an unholy alliance, and I think almost is not actually necessary. I think it kind of is.
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.